Chapter 22, China and India into the 21st century. So this chapter starts with the early 1900s and goes through the early 2000s. And it's really a look at China and India and a comparison of China and India. And just to give you some of that up front, and these are important, both China and India experienced European domination, meaning they were dominated by European countries. Also, China and India were both mostly agrarian cultures, meaning they relied heavily on farming. China and India did experience very different paths of development, though. Both countries gained freedom from foreign control in the late 1940s. India had been a part of the British Empire and became independent in 1947, and China had been under the influence of Germany, Great Britain, France, Russia, and Japan, and experienced victory in 1949. So those are some of the similarities. They did develop different economic strategies. India chose democratic electoral politics and like a mixture of socialism and capitalism with cultural ties to the West. Remember, they were influenced or dominated by Great Britain and continued to be influenced by Great Britain even after they achieved independence. China, however, experienced a communist revolution. So at first they looked to the Soviet Union for advice and assistance. Soon they came into conflict with them, so that didn't last very long. But China asserted strong central control, whereas India went more toward the democratic route. So we're starting with China and the prelude to revolution. So two groups emerged from the 1911 revolution in China. And again, the 1911 revolution in China was the overthrow of the last Chinese imperial dynasty. And this caused military and political chaos and an end to a 2,000-year period of imperial rule. And so these two groups that emerged were Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang. This is group one. And the second group that emerged under the leadership of Mao Zedong was the peasants, or the communists. So the Kuomintang, led by Chiang Kai-shek, this was the first group. And Chiang Kai-shek had risen through the ranks as a student. He took Sun Yat-sen's place after Sun Yat-sen died. He was a Methodist like Sun. He married a Chinese Christian woman. He valued Christian missions. And he favored the business community. The business leaders backed him because they thought that he would prevent striking among unions. So Chiang Kai-shek appealed to business people. The communists, led by Mao Zedong, this is group two here, cared very little about the West or staying connected to the West. They just wanted a strong, unified China. And Mao Zedong favored the peasantry. He realized that he could not have a band of guerrilla warriors without the peasantry or the cooperation of the peasants. So he ordered that they be treated with respect. Both Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong revered the three people's principles of Sun Yat-sen. So these two groups that emerged engaged in power struggles from 1925 to 1937, and they were fighting over control of China. So like I said, group one, Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang, they promoted Neo-Confucian values, and they were very pro-Western in their approach to government. The GMD, or we'll go ahead and call them the GMD, they received support from foreign investors, from missionaries, from outside educational groups. They even actually had some support from the Soviet Comintern, which was the international organization that advocated world communism, even though Chiang Kai-shek wasn't a communist. He failed in the power struggle because he alienated the peasants. Remember, he supported the business people. And so to the peasants, the communists looked like a good alternative because Mao Zedong was for the peasants in order that they be treated with respect. So Mao Zedong, the Peasant Revolt, and the CP. Mao had very few ties to the West. Honestly, he didn't even know very much about the West. When I say the West, I'm referring to the United States and Europe. He had no desire to be connected with those nations at all. He arrived in Beijing in time for the May 4th movement. The May 4th movement was an anti-imperialist cultural and political movement that was growing out of student demonstrations in Beijing. It was May 4th, 1919, and students had gathered to protest the Chinese government's weak response to the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles, of course, concluded World War I, and the treaty had allowed Japan to have some Chinese territory. And these demonstrations sparked national protests and an upsurge of Chinese nationalism. And so there was a move toward a populist base or a common people base rather than a base of intellectual elites. So peasant organization and guerrilla warfare. The key was the peasants, really. If you look at Group 1 and Group 2, again, Chiang Kai-shek in Group 1 was all about the business people. Mao Zedong in Group 2 was all about the peasants. And the relationship with the peasants held the key to success. Chiang Kai-shek and the GMD attacked the workers. The peasants should have been the center of his party. So the GMD actually drove those people, many of them who were communists, from the city to the countryside, where they organized into bands of guerrilla fighters. So gender issues under Mao. Mao made a really smart decision when he recognized the start of the women's rights movement. There were communist magazines that were put out that criticized Confucius for his patriarchy and the forced obedience to authority. And so Mao really appealed to women. He restructured the labor and the military to give more power and scope of action to women. Guerrilla warfare even required all available sources, and women usually helped with the production side of guerrilla warfare. And when Mao won, ultimately, spoiler alert, he's the one who wins this victory, he created a new marriage law that forbid arranged marriages. He encouraged free choice of partners, and he allowed divorce. So again, Mao appealed to peasants and women. The Long March / Communist Triumph, 1934 to 1949. So this began with 5 military expeditions by the GMD that started with 100,000 men and ended with 1 million men. And as the GMD, led by Chiang Kai-shek, began these attacks, the response of Mao and the Red Army, or the Communist Army, was to retreat. And it's called the Long March because they went on a 6,000-mile march. This started with 80,000 people, and by the end was sort of dwindled down to 20,000. There were 20,000 who finished the march, including 35 women. In the process of this, Mao establishes his capital at Yan'an. I'm sure I butchered that. And this became his capital, and this is where he built up his army. And during this civil war in China between Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek, the Japanese attack. And so there was this very short-lived collaboration between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong as they fought off the Japanese. This is when the infamous Rape of Nanking occurred. It was called that because they raped the women, they ravished the land, they destroyed the place. And the Chinese used the scorched earth policy, just continually retreating, burning the land, and the Japanese were finally defeated 7 years later in 1945. So after this is over, the GMD and the communists continue fighting. and ultimately the communists win. The GMD is driven out in 1949. They retreat to Taiwan, and Chiang Kai-shek claimed that Taiwan was the true China. So we all know Taiwan is not the true China. So in 1949, the communists take over and China becomes a communist nation. So we're looking at the revolutionary policies from 1949 to 1969. The principles of the Long March. This was a tightly knit group of people, and they wanted to work hard to enforce conformity. And so they did this through brainwashing, pretty much. The goals of the Communist Party were really two things. One was universal literacy, meaning everyone could read and write. And two, the implementation of appropriate technology. Within that, they wanted to redistribute the land. In many instances, they actually shot the landlords and took their land from them and redistributed it to the peasants. Mao wanted to incorporate cities into his plans, but strongly control urban life or city life. There was opposition to communism in some cities that included the development of capitalism, political protest, and internationalism. But ultimately, Mao kept control of the region because he promoted military strength. And oddly, he valued guerrilla warfare over military technology. So guerrilla warfare is like bands of people fighting out in the middle of nowhere, and their tactics are like ambush and quick surprise attacks. It's not formal fighting. Mao also adopted a 5-year plan based on the Soviet model. Stalin himself had many 5-year plans. Initially, Mao allowed for democratic input. This ended as democratic input meant criticism of his party. He even said, "Let 100 flowers bloom, let 100 schools of thought contend." So it's called "Let 100 Flowers Bloom," but he temporarily allowed people to criticize his government. Democracy even seemed possible for a little while there. Students wrote on the democracy wall in Beijing, but this ultimately led to unrest, and so the government had to step in, reverse its policies, throw people in jail, send them to labor camps, or exile them to farms. So Mao eventually put his foot down on this temporary democracy that, of course, led to criticism of his party. So his program was called the Great Leap Forward, and one of the things he did was that he lumped all of rural Chinese or Chinese countryside into these communes, and he did it so that he could speed up production. He sent people to live in the villages so that they could increase production. The Cultural Revolution, Mao removed several old school bureaucrats, purged old party members, and replaced them with students and military guys, armed forces called the Red Guard. Whenever you hear the word red, think communism, if we're talking about the 1950s or after. Mao really attempted to reestablish the spirit of the Long March, as there was such a bond built there, but he couldn't because there was starving and chaos in the countryside. So the peasants were, even though he had sided with the peasants, they were still experiencing chaos and unrest. So recovery, 1970 to 1976. This is distinguished by the fact that China began to back off of their communist policies slightly. There was a group called the People's Liberation Army that began to suppress the Red Guards or the Communist Army because they had wreaked chaos in the name of Mao. Also, China normalized diplomatic relations with the United States. Remember, Mao was not about making connections with the West, and so in the 70s they did make connections with the United States. During the recovery period, they saw improvement of the economy, especially with a focus on steel production. They began to address poor performance in agriculture. China had a really tough time producing things. It was agonizingly slow growth of agriculture that couldn't keep up with the population growth. So in this period of recovery, they began to back off slightly of some of the communist policies that Mao had put into place. So international relations. With the USSR, remember the thing that China had in common with the USSR was that they were both communist. Well, they were chief allies until 1961, and this diplomatic relations broke off from 1961 to 1985. There were also boundary disputes throughout the era in Central Asia between China and the USSR. The United States. The U.S. had actually supported Chiang Kai-shek's forces because he wasn't communist. President Truman was criticized because he didn't back Chiang Kai-shek enough. There also, you have during the 50s the Korean War, which involved both the U.S. and China. The U.S. backed South Korea, and China backed North Korea. So that brought them at odds with each other. Also, the invasion of Tibet by China caused the Dalai Lama to flee to India. So there was some strife there as the U.S. criticized China for its invasion of Tibet. China did join the United Nations in 1971, so that was a step toward diplomatic relations with the U.S. And in 1972, President Nixon even visited China. So this was the complete normalization of relations in 1972, mainly because they could produce stuff for us cheaply, and we wanted an economic relationship with them. In regards to East Asia, like I said, they invaded Tibet. They had supported a murderous communist party in Cambodia. The Japanese didn't really have a good history with China because of the rape of Nanjing in 1937. Not to mention the Japanese and Chinese economies were at odds after World War II. In Indonesia, there were anti-Chinese riots. With the growth of Indonesian nationalism, thousands of Chinese were murdered in Indonesia. In India, the Chinese and the Indians actually collaborated at the Bandung Conference, where both China and India served as leaders and offered advice and leadership to nations emerging from colonialism in 1955. However, China invaded India in 1962 over differences in border demarcations. In general, though, the Chinese were improving their relationships with foreign countries. So in post-revolutionary China, they were leaving behind a century of national humiliation. Because of colonialism and war, they had been dominated by all kinds of European countries. And so this was marked by a period of Chinese stability and ideological purity, the lessening of communism, really. And recently, China has even begun to seek a larger place in the world. So we'll go ahead and conclude here, and we'll pick up in the next video with India.